There are moments that divide a life into before and after. Not the large ones, not the deaths or the births or the decisions made in rooms where the future is being negotiated by people who hold more of it than they deserve. The small ones. The ones that happen in the middle of an ordinary evening, in a room full of people who are not paying attention. When the specific configuration of two lives intersects and neither life is the same afterward. The music had been playing for an hour. The hall was full. 300 wolves at the Autumn Concord, the annual diplomatic gathering that brought every allied territory together for 3 days of negotiation and 2 evenings of the specific social performance that territories used to assess each other when the formal talks were done. Orla Mickelson was not supposed to be in the hall. She was supposed to be in the translation office on the 2nd floor, where she had been working for 11 hours on the specific, detail-intensive labor of converting 3 territorial agreements from their original dialects into the common trade language that all parties could sign. She was the Fjellvik territory's senior translator, a position that required fluency in 6 dialects, a memory that the chief diplomat had described as architecturally improbable, and the willingness to work the specific brutal hours that diplomatic seasons demanded. She was in the hall because the chief diplomat had found a discrepancy in the 3rd agreement's territorial boundary clause, a translation ambiguity that could be read 2 ways, one of which gave the Valdran territory an additional 40 miles of fishing rights, and he needed her in the hall to clarify the language with the Valdran delegate before the morning session. She had come from the translation office in her working clothes, the practical dress she wore for long shifts, ink on her right hand's middle finger where the pen rested, her hair in the specific arrangement that comfort required rather than appearance demanded. She had come to do a job and leave. She had not come to dance. Chapter 1. The discrepancy was in subsection 4. Orla found the Valdran delegate, Lord Haraldson, near the refreshment table, where he was performing the specific social function of being approachable while holding a drink. She approached him with the professional directness that 11 hours of translation work produced, not rude, not abrupt, simply operating on the specific frequency of someone whose patience for social navigation had been spent on linguistic precision and who had none left over. "Lord Haraldson," she said. Subsection 4. The boundary clause. The original Valdran dialect uses a term that maps to either watershed boundary or riverbed boundary in common trade language. The distinction changes the fishing rights allocation by 40 miles. I need you to confirm which reading is intended. Haraldson looked at her. He looked at the hall, which was in the middle of the social performance. He looked at her ink-stained hand and her working dress, and the specific energy of a woman who had materialized from a translation office to discuss subsection 4 in the middle of a diplomatic dance. "Now," he said. "The agreement goes to signing in the morning," she said. 40 miles of fishing rights is not a thing I am comfortable leaving ambiguous overnight. Haraldson, who was a diplomat of 30 years' experience and who recognized precision when it was standing in front of him, set down his drink. "Watershed boundary," he said. "The Valdran intention is the topographical definition, not the hydrological." "Thank you," she said. She turned to leave. "You're the Fjellvik translator," he said. "Orla Mickelson. Your reputation precedes you. Halvdan says you corrected a treaty mistranslation last year that had been in effect for 11 years. The mistranslation was costing the Grindal territory 12,000 in annual fishing levies," she said. "The correction was overdue. He also says you are the most precise person he has ever worked with and the most difficult to have at a dinner party." "I don't attend dinner parties," she said. "They interfere with the work." She turned to leave again. She made it 4 steps. "You." The voice came from behind her left shoulder, close enough to be conversational and carrying the specific quality of someone who was accustomed to the distance between their voice and other people's attention being very short. The translator. "Stay." She turned. Alpha King Stellan Rask of the Nordvik territory was taller than diplomatic intelligence had described him, which was notable because diplomatic intelligence had described him as very tall. He had the particular face of someone whose genetics had collaborated with experience to produce something that was not handsome in the polished sense but compelling in the structural sense, the architecture of a man who had been built for authority and who wore it the way other people wore their skin, as something that was simply there, rather than something that had been applied. He was looking at her with the specific attention of a man who had overheard a conversation and found it more interesting than anything else happening in the hall. "Your Majesty," she said. "Subsection 4, he said. "The watershed boundary." "You were listening." "I was standing 12 feet away," he said. "You were not being quiet about the fishing rights." "Fishing rights are not a subject that benefits from being quiet," she said. Something happened to his face. The specific shift that she would later learn was his version of amusement, Not a smile, not the diplomatic warmth that kings produced for social occasions, but a rearrangement of the internal architecture that was visible in the eyes before it reached the mouth. "Dance with me," he said. She looked at the hall, at the music that was playing and the couples that were moving through the specific choreography of diplomatic dancing. The particular social performance that she had spent 11 hours not participating in. She looked at her working dress and her ink-stained hand and the fact that she had come to the hall to resolve a subsection ambiguity and not for any other reason. "I don't dance," she said. "You don't attend dinner parties," he said. "I heard. Dance with me anyway." "Your Majesty, I have 11 hours of translation work waiting. The work will be there in 4 minutes," he said. "I am asking for one dance." She looked at him. At the specific quality of the asking, not a command, despite the phrasing, but the particular request of a man who was interested in something and who was accustomed to being direct about the interest because directness was more efficient than the alternative. She could refuse. The refusal was available. He was a visiting king at a diplomatic gathering, and she was a working translator, and the social hierarchy placed no obligation on her to accept. "One dance," she said. "And then I'm going back to subsection 4. One dance," he agreed. Chapter 2. The dance was a traditional Concord waltz, structured, formal, the specific three-quarter time that diplomatic events had been using for 2 centuries because the rhythm allowed conversation while the movement prevented the conversation from becoming too stationary. He danced well. This did not surprise her. Kings were trained in everything, and dancing was one of the everythings. What surprised her was the quality of the dancing. Not the technical execution, which was competent, but the specific way he held the frame, firm without being rigid, leading without dragging. The particular balance of a man who understood that leading a dance was not the same thing as controlling the person in it. "You translate 6 dialects," he said. 2 measures in. 7, she said. "The 7th is a recent acquisition." "Which one?" "Old Valdrin. The pre-trade dialect. It's necessary for the historical treaty archive. The foundational agreements are in Old Valdrin and the existing translations are." She paused. "Approximate translations of foundational treaties," he said. "That seems like a significant problem." "It is a significant problem," she said. "It is the reason I work 11-hour days during diplomatic season. The approximations have been producing discrepancies for decades, and no one noticed because no one was reading the originals. Until you. Until me." He turned her through the waltz's standard figure, the specific choreographic element that created a moment where the partners separated by arm's length and then returned. In the separation, she saw the hall noticing them. The particular collective attention of 300 wolves registering that the Nordvik king was dancing with the Fjellvik translator in her working dress. She did not care about the noticing. She had spent 11 hours caring about subsection 4, and she had no caring left over for the opinions of 300 wolves about her dance partner or her wardrobe. "You don't care that they're watching," he said, reading her face with the same attention he had applied to the conversation about fishing rights. "They are watching because you are a king," she said. "I am incidental to the watching. The watching would happen regardless of who you were dancing with." "You are not incidental," he said. "I am a translator in a work dress with ink on my hand," she said. "I am the definition of incidental at a diplomatic dance. You are the woman who walked across a ballroom to discuss fishing rights with a Valdrin lord, and who has just told me that the foundational treaty archive has been mistranslated for decades," he said. "You are the most interesting person in this hall." She looked at him. They were close, the waltz demanded it, the specific proximity that the dance's choreography required. From this distance, she could see the thing she had noted from 12 feet. The specific internal architecture that preceded the visible amusement, except that now it was not amusement. It was something else. Something that had the quality of a man who had been at diplomatic events his entire life, and who had found, in the middle of this particular one, a thing he had not expected to find. The music ended. The waltz concluded. She stepped back. He held the frame for a fraction of a second longer than the choreography required, and then he released it, and the releasing was clean and immediate, and she noted that the fraction of a second had existed, and that the release had been his decision rather than hers, and that the decision had been made correctly. "Thank you for the dance," she said. "Thank you for subsection 4, he said. She turned to leave. 4 minutes. One dance. She was going back to the translation office. She made it 6 steps this time. "May I have the next dance?" The voice was not his. It belonged to a man she did not recognize. Mid-30s, the specific bearing of minor nobility. The particular confidence of someone who had watched a king dance with a translator and had concluded that the translator was now a person worth approaching. She looked at the man. She looked at the dance floor. No, she said. I have work. Surely the work can wait for. The work involves 40 miles of fishing rights and a mistranslated boundary clause that has been producing discrepancies for 11 years, she said. It cannot wait for a dance. The man opened his mouth to persist. He did not get the chance. She said no. Stellan Rask's voice, from behind her shoulder again, carrying the specific quality that she would later learn, was his version of displeasure. Not loud, not aggressive, simply present in a way that made the space around it very clear. The lady has work. Let her go to it. The man closed his mouth. The man left. Orla turned. Stellan was standing where he had been standing, the specific position of a man who had not moved toward the interaction but whose voice had covered the distance. I did not need you to do that, she said. I know, he said. You had already said no. He was not listening to your no. I made it louder. She looked at him. The distinction he had drawn, not rescuing her but amplifying her, was precise in the way that she found things precise. He had not stepped in front of her. He had stood behind her and added volume to the words she had already said. Thank you, she said. Go translate your fishing rights, he said. She went. Chapter 3. She did not see him again for 4 months. The Concord ended. The agreements were signed. Subsection 4 was correctly translated, watershed boundary, topographical definition, the Valdrin fishing rights accurately delineated for the first time in 11 years. She returned to the translation office and she worked, and she did not think about the dance or the voice behind her shoulder or the specific fraction of a second between the music ending and the frame releasing. She did not think about it, because thinking about it was not productive, and she was a productive person, and the thinking would have interfered with the 7 dialects, and the foundational archive, and the 11-hour days that the work required. She thought about it anyway. This was inconvenient. The thinking happened in the specific margins of her days, the minutes before sleep, the walk from her quarters to the office, the brief pause between one document and the next when her mind, having completed one task, had not yet fully engaged with the next and occupied the gap with the specific involuntary recall of a waltz in a ballroom, and a man who had said you are the most interesting person in this hall with the tone of someone stating an observed fact rather than performing a compliment. 4 months after the Concord, a letter arrived. It was addressed to her, not to the translation office, not to the Fjellvik diplomatic service, but to her specifically by name. The seal was Nordvik's. The handwriting was not a secretary's. She opened it. The letter was short. It contained one question, written in Old Valdrin, the 7th dialect, the recent acquisition, the one she had mentioned during the dance. The question, translated, was, would you consider a consulting engagement with the Nordvik Territorial Archive? Our foundational treaties have the same problem yours did. Beneath the question, in common trade language, I have been thinking about approximate translations for 4 months. I find the approximation increasingly unacceptable. SR. She read the letter 3 times. The first time, she read the Old Valdrin, which was grammatically correct and idiomatically competent, which meant he had either written it himself or had someone very skilled write it for him, and the specific quality of the handwriting, consistent, unpracticed. The hand of someone writing in a language they were familiar with but did not use daily, suggested the former. The second time, she read the subtext, which was that a king had written to a translator in the translator's specialist language to discuss a problem they had talked about for 3 minutes during a dance. The third time, she read the thing underneath the subtext, which was that the approximate translations were not the only thing he found increasingly unacceptable. She wrote back, in Old Valdrin, the consulting engagement would be acceptable. The archive work was genuinely needed. The approximate translations were genuinely a problem. She did not address the underneath. She addressed it in person, 3 weeks later, when she arrived at the Nordvik stronghold. Chapter 4. The Nordvik archive was, as he had described, a problem. Not a small problem, a structural problem. The specific accumulated consequence of decades of translations that had been good enough for the purposes they had served at the time and that were now, under the specific scrutiny that modern diplomacy required, demonstrably inadequate. The foundational treaties had been translated by scholars who spoke the original dialects competently but not fluently, and the gap between competently and fluently was, in treaty language, the gap between approximately right and actually right, and approximately right in a treaty, was a thing that cost territories money and land and the specific trust that diplomatic relationships required. She worked the way she always worked, 11-hour days. The translation office that the Nordvik steward had set up for her in the East Wing. The specific focused precision that her mind required and that the work demanded. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The goodness was not a performance, it was the specific quality of a mind that operated at a frequency that most minds did not reach, and that she had learned, over 26 years, to direct toward the things that mattered. She did not see Stellan for the first 3 days. This was not avoidance, he was governing, which was what kings did, and she was translating, which was what she did, and their schedules did not overlap because their work occupied different hours in different rooms. She noted the not seeing and she filed it, and she continued working. On the 4th day, he came to the translation office. He came at 7 in the evening, which was when her day was ending and which she would later learn was when his day was also ending. The specific convergence of 2 schedules that had found each other's conclusion point. He stood in the doorway. She was at the desk, surrounded by the specific organized disorder of a translation in progress. Original texts, reference materials, her notes in 3 dialects. The working draft that she was building word by careful word. "The archive," he said, "is worse than you described," she said, without looking up. "The 3rd foundational treaty has been mistranslated in a way that gives the Grindal territory a claim to the Nordvik northern timber rights that they do not actually possess. The mistranslation has been in effect for 43 years. He came into the room. He sat in the chair across from her desk, which was there because the office had been set up for a translator who might receive visitors, and which he occupied with the specific settled quality of a man who had found where he wanted to be. 43 years, he said. The original uses a term that maps to harvesting rights in the competent translation and access rights in the fluent translation, she said. Harvesting is active, it grants the right to cut timber. Access is passive, it grants the right to transit the territory. The difference is the entire northern forest. The entire northern forest, he repeated. I thought you should know before the morning session. He looked at the documents. At the specific evidence of a problem that had been invisible until someone with the right eyes looked at it. You found this in 4 days, he said. I found it in 4 hours, she said. I have spent the remaining 3 days verifying the finding, because a 43-year mistranslation that involves an entire forest is not something I report without verification. He looked at her. The gray eyes, she had remembered them correctly from the Concord, the specific quality of attention that was comprehensive without being invasive, that read without demanding. You wrote to me in Old Valdrin, she said. I did. The grammar was correct. I studied it, he said. After the Concord. Not formally, I found texts. I practiced. He paused. I wanted to write to you in the language you valued most. It seemed. He stopped. Respectful. She looked at her desk, at the Old Valdrin texts she had been working with all day, the specific ancient language that most people learned out of obligation, and that she had learned out of love, and that he had learned, in 4 months, from texts, without a teacher, because he wanted to write her a letter in it. That is the most respectful thing anyone has done regarding my work, she said. It is not regarding your work, he said. It is regarding you. The translation office was very quiet. The evening light came through the single window and caught the documents and the ink and the specific accumulated evidence of a woman's expertise spread across every available surface. The dance, she said. The dance, he agreed. You asked me to dance because you found the fishing rights conversation interesting. I asked you to dance because you found the fishing rights conversation urgent, he said. Most people do not find subsection 4 urgent at a diplomatic ball. You did. The urgency was compelling, she said. I have attended diplomatic events since I was 18, he said. 14 years. In 14 years I have never met someone who crossed a ballroom in a work dress to discuss fishing rights with the specific intensity of a person who believed that 40 miles of water mattered more than 300 people's opinion of her wardrobe. He held her gaze. You were the first real thing I had seen at one of those events in 14 years. She looked at her hands. At the ink on her middle finger, the permanent mark of her work, the specific evidence of the thing she did every day that defined her days. I do not know how to do this, she said. This thing. Where a king learns Old Valdrin to write a letter and sits in a translation office and tells me I was real. She paused. I know how to translate. I know how to find 43-year-old errors. I do not know how to be found, he said. She looked at him. You don't know how to be found, he said, because you have spent your life in translation offices doing work that is invisible and essential and that no one sees, because the work's entire purpose is to make things clear for other people. He paused. I see the work. I see you doing it. I find both. Compelling. You keep using that word. It is the accurate word, he said. I have looked for a better one. There isn't one. Chapter 5. The consulting engagement was scheduled for 3 weeks. She stayed for 7. Not because the archive required 7 weeks, the archive required approximately 12. But the initial assessment and the critical corrections could be completed in the time she had. She stayed for 7 because the work kept expanding as she went deeper into the foundational texts, and because each layer she uncovered produced new findings that required verification, and because this was the part she examined with the same precision she applied to treaty language. Leaving had become a thing she was not ready to do. They talked every evening. The translation office at 7, which became their specific geography, the desk between them, the documents around them, the particular quality of a shared space that had developed its own rules and rhythms without either of them formally establishing them. He told her about Nordvik. Not the governance, the territory itself. The specific landscape that the treaties described in legal language and that he described in the language of someone who had grown up walking it. The northern forest, the one the timber rights concerned, was a place he went to think. The central river basin that the watershed boundary defined was where his family's holdings had been for 6 generations. He described these things with the particular attention of a man who loved his territory the way she loved Old Valdrin, not as a professional obligation but as a thing that was part of him. She told him about the dialects, about the specific way that language encoded the thinking of the people who spoke it, how Old Valdrin's grammar structure reflected a worldview that organized reality differently from the common trade language, how the mistranslations she found were not just errors but evidence of the specific failure of one way of thinking to accommodate another. You translate between worldviews, he said. I translate between ways of seeing, she said. The words are the mechanism. The seeing is the substance. And when you look at me, he said, what do you see? She had been looking at him for 5 weeks. The looking had accumulated into something she could describe with the specific precision she applied to everything, because the precision was not a professional tool but a personal quality, and it applied to the personal as thoroughly as it applied to the professional. I see a man who learned a dead language to write a letter, she said, who sat in a ballroom and found a conversation about fishing rights more interesting than 300 people performing diplomacy, who amplified a refusal rather than replacing it. She held his gaze. Who comes to a translation office every evening and talks to a woman who has ink on her hands about the specific way that language encodes seeing. And what does that translate to, he said. In Old Valdrin, she said, there is a word, ondervisk, that has no equivalent in common trade language. The approximate translations render it as recognition or understanding. Those are competent translations. They are not fluent. What is the fluent translation? The closest I have found, she said, is the specific experience of seeing something for the first time and understanding that you have always been looking for it. The office was very still. Ondervisk, he said. Yes. And that is what you see. That is what I translate to, she said. When I look at you. The specific experience of finding the thing I didn't know I was looking for. She paused. I am a translator. I work in precision. I want the precision to be clear. He reached across the desk. She gave him her hand, the ink-stained one, the hand that carried the evidence of her work. He held it with the specific quality of someone holding something that was both fragile and essential, the quality she recognized from the dance, firm without rigid, leading without dragging. Clear, he said. Completely clear. Chapter 6. The consulting engagement ended. The Nordvik archive's critical corrections were complete. 14 foundational treaty errors identified, documented, and corrected, including the Northern Timber Rights and 3 others that had significant territorial implications. She had produced, in 7 weeks, the most comprehensive revision of a territorial archive that the Nordvik Records Office had seen in its history. And the records steward had told her, with the specific professional emotion of a man whose archive had just been rescued from 43 years of accumulated error, that her work was the finest he had ever encountered. She packed her things. She prepared to return to Fjellvik. She stood in the translation office on the last evening and looked at the desk that had been hers for 7 weeks, and the chair across from it that had been his every evening at 7, and the specific absence that the room would hold when both of them were gone from it. He came at 7, last time. The archive is corrected, she said. I know. The remaining work, the 8 treaties that need full retranslation rather than correction, can be done remotely. I can send the translations by courier. You can, he said. That is the practical arrangement. It is the practical arrangement, he agreed. He sat in the chair. His chair. It is also the arrangement that puts 700 miles between the translator and the archive. The translations do not require proximity, she said. The translations do not, he said. Other things do. She looked at the window. At the Nordvik evening that she had been watching for 7 weeks, the specific quality of light that the Northern Territory produced at this hour, which was different from Fjellvik's light in ways she could describe with linguistic precision and could feel with something less precise and more important. I have a position in Fjellvik, she said. The work there is, essential and invisible, and something you are very good at, and something that will continue to be there regardless of when you return to it, he said. Yes. You're finishing my sentences. I am translating your hesitation, he said. You are hesitating because leaving is practical and staying is not, and you have organized your life around the practical, because the practical is what you can control. He held her eyes. I am suggesting that the practical is not the only framework available. What is the other framework? Ondervisk, he said. She pressed her lips together, the gesture she used when something was happening that she needed a moment with. You learned the word, she said. I learned the language, he said. For you. The word was the part that mattered most, and I have been carrying it for 3 weeks and I would like to use it now. She looked at the desk, at 7 weeks of work, and 7 weeks of evenings, and the specific accumulated evidence of 2 people who had found each other across a ballroom, and a letter, and a dead language, and who were now standing at the point where the finding either became a thing that lasted, or a thing that was filed. The Fjellvik position, she said, can be held remotely, he said. Your chief diplomat can courier the work. Your translation office can be replicated here. The archive needs 12 more weeks of your attention. The position, he paused. The position I am offering is not a consulting engagement. What is the position? Beside me, he said. At the desk and at the table and at whatever comes after. Not as a translator. As the person the king learned a dead language for. She looked at him. She looked at the chair he was sitting in, and the desk between them and the evening light and the 7 weeks that had built, without either of them designing it, the specific architecture of a thing that worked. I will need my own office, she said. You have one. I will need access to the full archive, not just the foundational treaties. Full access. And the work continues, she said. The translations, the corrections, the specific 11-hour days that the work requires. The work does not become secondary to thee. The work is why I wrote to you, he said. The work is the first thing I found compelling. The work does not become secondary to anything. She looked at the ink on her hand, at the specific permanent evidence of the thing she did that defined her and that he had found, at a diplomatic ball in a work dress, the most interesting thing in the room. Ondervisk, she said. Yes, he said. That word really does not translate. I know, he said. That is why it is the right word. She reached across the desk. He took her hand. The ink-stained hand, the work evidence hand, the hand that had carried a pen through 7 dialects and 14 treaty corrections and 43 years of accumulated error. He held it the way he had held the dance frame, firm without rigid, present without possessive. The specific quality of a man who understood that holding something was not the same as owning it, and that the distinction was the entire point. Chapter 7. She stayed. The staying was not a single decision but a daily one. The specific repeated choice of a woman who had organized her life around precision and who found in the choosing that precision and emotion were not the opposing forces she had believed them to be, but complementary ones, the way a well-translated treaty was both technically accurate and meaningfully true. She worked. The archive consumed another 12 weeks of her attention, and then the attention became ongoing, because archives were living things, and the maintenance of accurate translation was not a project but a practice. The Nordvik records steward, a man named Halvard Fjell who had spent 30 years in the archive and who had found, in Orla's arrival, the professional partner he had given up hoping for, collaborated with her on a systematic review that would take, by his estimate, 3 years and that he described, with the specific satisfaction of a man whose life's work had just been validated, as the most important thing that has happened to this archive since its founding. The territory learned her the way territories learned things, through observation, through the specific distributed attention of 400 wolves who registered changes in their environment and formed opinions about them. The opinions were, initially, the opinions that courts formed about things they did not understand. Who was she? Why was she here? What did her presence mean in the specific political vocabulary that courts used to interpret everything? The opinions changed. They changed because she worked, and the work was visible, and the work's quality was undeniable. They changed because the 14 treaty corrections produced 3 territorial adjustments that benefited the Nordvik population directly, and because the population noticed, and because noticing that the translator's work had improved their lives was the specific kind of evidence that changed opinions faster than any amount of political positioning. They changed because Stellan did not hide her. This was the thing that mattered most and that she had not expected. He did not present her as a diplomatic asset or a consulting specialist or any of the institutional categories that would have made her presence explicable to the court's framework. He presented her as the person she was, a translator who had come to correct an archive and who had stayed because the staying was chosen by both of them. At the first formal event she attended, a territorial reception, 3 months after the Concord, he walked into the hall with her beside him. Not behind. Not following. Beside, the specific parallel position that she had noticed in the forest ride and the evening walks and every physical space they had occupied together. She was wearing a work dress, the same work dress. The same ink on her hand. He had not asked her to change. She had not offered. The translator, Lord Erickson, said at the reception with the specific tone of a man evaluating the situation. In a work dress. The translator, Stellan said, in the dress she chooses. The court will accommodate. The court accommodated. Not instantly. Courts did not accommodate instantly. But with the specific incremental adjustment of an institution recognizing that the new variable was permanent, and that the permanent variable was not interested in adjusting herself for the institution's comfort. Epilogue. A year after the Concord, the Fjellvik delegation arrived for the annual signing. The chief diplomat, Halvdan, who had been Orla's employer for 6 years, and who had received her transfer with the specific professional grief of a man losing his best translator, and the specific personal satisfaction of a man who understood why, came to the Nordvik stronghold for the treaty renewal. Ceremony. He found Orla in the archive. She was at her desk, the permanent desk, in the permanent office, surrounded by the specific organized accumulation of a year's work. She was translating. Ink on her hand. Hair in the comfort arrangement. The specific unchanged quality of a person who had moved 700 miles and changed nothing about herself except her address. You look exactly the same, Halvdan said. I am exactly the same, she said. I am the same person doing the same work in a different archive. The specifics changed. The substance did not. The King of Nordvik learned Old Valdrin for you. He learned Old Valdrin because the foundational treaties required it, she said. Then, after a pause, and for me. Halvdan looked at the office, at the documents and the reference texts and the specific evidence of a year's work that had produced 23 treaty corrections and a territorial archive that was, for the first time in its history, accurately translated. There is a word, he said, that you once told me about. In Old Valdrin. Ondervisk, she said. You told me it did not translate. It doesn't. You also told me it meant something like seeing something for the first time and knowing you had always been looking for it. That is the approximate translation, she said. And the fluent translation? She looked at the window, at the Nordvik light, the specific quality that was different from Fjellvik's and that she had been watching for a year, and that she had not stopped finding remarkable. The fluent translation, she said, is what happens when precision meets the thing precision was designed for. When the specific careful attention you bring to everything finally encounters the thing that deserves all of it. That is not a translation, Halvdan said. That is a love letter. She looked at the ink on her hand, at the permanent mark of the permanent work in the permanent office in the territory she had chosen. Yes, she said. It is. At the treaty signing that evening, she stood beside Stellan at the head table. Not behind, beside. The specific parallel position. She was wearing her work dress. She had ink on her hand. The Fjellvik delegation saw her, and Halvdan raised his glass, and the Nordvik court raised their glasses, and the specific quality of the moment was not the quality of a diplomatic toast, but the quality of something being acknowledged, the specific fact that a woman who had crossed a ballroom in a work dress to discuss fishing rights had found, in the crossing, the thing the Old Valdrin language had a word for and the common trade language did not. Stellan looked at her. She looked at him. More than 3 seconds. Considerably more. The hall did not mind.